Okay. Hello. My name is Loren Rattler. I just want to very quickly thank the National Congress of American Indians for certainly inviting us and allowing us to share a lot of the work that we're doing in Blackfeet country with you all. And I'm very honored to be up here with these three beautiful women, three beautiful Native women. I'm also very honored to be in the same company as them. As you look at many of the initiatives that are going on across the country, gives me great honor to sit up with these ladies. And so I certainly appreciate that as well. So I like to start with with a few quotes, right? The first is that tribes will never attain true sovereignty without first attaining food sovereignty. So as we think about economics, sustainable economics, all of that, it's very important for us to be thinking about how we create sustainable economics through commercial food production. And so the ability to feed ourselves, to put that food back into our local food delivery system, to make correlations to a more holistic approach. So that was a quote that was said by Ross Racine, the former executive director for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. And then the second one is that last quote on the bottom: when our hands are facing up, we will always be hungry. When our hands are facing down and we're working the earth, we will never be hungry. That was a native Hawaiian elder. So it's really along the same lines as the biblical. If you teach someone to fish, they'll certainly feed themselves, right? If you give them a fish, they become dependent. So as we think about moving our tribal economies from a public sector-based economy to a private sector-based economy, it's very important that food sovereignty and commercial food production serve as the foundation for the expansion of that economy. Never ever in our history, for any one of our peoples were we dependent. Right? We always provided for our families, provided for our tribe. It wasn't until our foodways changed that we became dependent. So as we reclaim that space as tribal governments and we exercise our sovereignty, it's very important to remember that our people were never dependent, right? So we need to reclaim that space and move toward independence for our people as well. We do that through investments in the private sector, right? Private production. And so that's a lot of the work that we're working on at Blackfeet. So as we think about today's presentation, a roadmap, I'm going to talk a little bit about Blackfeet ways of knowing, how we utilize our core values, move them forward, and allow them to manifest in a modern context so that we can address many of those challenges that exist contemporarily today. I'm going to also be talking about a Western authority and how we utilize that as a foundation for all the work that we're doing. I'll also be talking about what the role of the tribal government is, how we plan from a holistic place, our current projects, and Blackfeet food sovereignty. And I'm going to attempt to do that in 20 minutes. But first, to understand what we're doing, you have to understand where we're at. We're right we border Glacier National Park on the west in northwestern Montana, Alberta, Canada on the north, and so we're a part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We have 3 tribes on the Alberta side, so it's really important to remember that because it allows us a lot of flexibility as we build sustainable economics and build our food-based economy. It's important to remember that because we have the ability to actually create international trade in a way that you can't do in many areas of the country. And so we're on 1.5 million acres. For any of you metric lovers, that's about 640,000 hectares, right? We're larger than the state of Delaware, about twice the size of Rhode Island, about the same size as the island nation of Puerto Rico. We just don't have the senators and the Congress people that represent those jurisdictions, right? We have a 9-member elected tribal council. The other part to remember is that we have 80% of the large vertebrates in the state of Montana in our little 1.5 million acres. So if you think about Montana, it's about 94 million acres, right? You take your 2 fingers on a very large map, right? That's the area that we represent, but we do have 55% of the region's biodiversity as well. So when you think about animal species, plant species, biohabitat protection, and a holistic approach to natural resource management, we want to utilize that to market our products at a much higher level, especially to folks that will buy based on the way that their food is raised, right? So the niche market. We have 5 watersheds. We have 100% rights to the 3 middle ones, shared rights on the north and the south. So all of that is integral as we think about the ability to utilize everything at your fingertips to really create commercial food production and market those products at a much higher rate. So when we think about Blackfeet ways of knowing, being, and planning, I was asked, I had the pleasure of presenting to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And I was asked how we utilize the UN's framework or their sustainable goals to really inform everything that we're doing in Blackfeet country. And I said, if I used UN sustainable goals in Blackfeet country, they'd tell me, go work someplace else, right? Go work for the UN, right? Here in Blackfeet country, we need to utilize the practice of who we are, our core values, to really inform what we're doing in a modern context, right? So that means Blackfeet ways of knowing, right? That means respect for all living things. Right, as a part of our E&E initiative, our bison reintroduction, we kept that chair empty, right, to remind us that it's up to us to speak for that bison. So as you look at the reintroduction of that bison, not only into the wild, but also as a livestock designation, right, because we'll never have the inventory of that bison to really make impacts in health and nutrition if we don't look at a dual designation. So it gives us the opportunity to remind ourselves that it's up to us to speak for all living things, right? The water, the earth, all of that. And if we can do that, we can really redefine delivery systems that have been defined in this country primarily by sole profitability. We can realign that with the practice of who we are as Native people and then market our products at a much higher rate. So we need to utilize our core values to really inform everything that we're doing. So we gain our authority in terms of, from a Western context, the legal framework from Public Law 103.77, which is the American Indian Agricultural Resource Management Act of 1993. So when you look at this legislation, it really provides tribes broad latitude, and I do mean broad latitude, right, to not only create plans that are conducive to their needs, but also to make correlations to how that's implemented. So as we think about federal agencies like the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Interior, if it is in your ARMP, then they have to follow that in terms of implementation. So it really provides a foundation for tribes to really reclaim that space, to really utilize their ability as a sovereign, right? Whether that's in international trade or whatever it may be, to really create the foundation to implement initiatives that, in our case, are community-based. And so the provision that we use most is the one that you see bolded there: define critical values of the tribe and its members and provide identified holistic management objectives. So when we think about holistic management objectives, really we're talking about systems planning, right? Which is aligned with the practice of who we are as Native people. So when you think about that system, you're really talking about the interdependent relationships and functions within that system. And if you recognize it as a system, then it's much easier to have a broader influence on things like health and nutrition, everything, right, that comes from commercial food production. So what is the role of the tribal government? So when I was hired to put together the Agricultural Resource Management Plan for the Blackfeet tribe, the first thing that I asked our tribal business council was, what role do you want to play in commercial food production? Do you want to compete against your producers? Do you want to create the framework that empowers your producers? Do you want to change our economy from a public sector-based economy where we're dependent on cyclical funding? Or do you want to invest in our people and create the conditions that allow them to really drive sustainable economics? When you look at smaller based tribes, they can take the tribal enterprise approach and are very successful in that. When you look at larger land-based tribes with a lot of members, right, you're never going to make a difference through per capita distribution, through dividend distribution. So we have to create the framework that allows our people to profit, right? That allows our people through private production to help us flip that economy and move away from that cyclical-based funding and create revenue-generating streams that underwrite not only the necessary inherent government functions, but also really provide a thriving atmosphere for our own people to be entrepreneurs, for our own people to do the production, for our own people to be profitable. And so the first of that triple bottom line, and what they told me and what come out of those conversations was, we want to create sustainable economics, in this case through commercial food production. The second thing that they said is, if we're not thinking about how we narrow the health disparities of our people, you can look at 6 of the top 7 killers of Blackfeet people and make that direct correlation to that high fructose diet, right? It is killing us, right? It creates inflammation. Inflammation leads to cancer. Number 1 killer of Blackfeet people. It also spurs autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, many other autoimmune diseases, liver disease, heart disease, diabetes. right? So if we're not thinking about how we utilize policy development to make the correlations to health and nutrition, how we change the culture in the way that we grow food, purchase food, prepare food, and ingest food, we're going to continue to have the challenges that the Western approach has not been successful in remedying. Right? So we need to think about how we utilize our sovereignty, the practice of who we are as Native people, to really address many of those concerns. So we have to think about how we're narrowing health disparities of our people. And then the third is how we invest in our most precious resource, right? We have two demographics that are important in Indian country, right? The first ones are elders, right? Who infuse wisdom in us, right? And then the second is our most precious resource, right? Our future. Our youth, right? How are we creating correlations to ensuring that we're instilling that institutional knowledge in our young people, right? So everything that we do at Blackfeet, you have to have those three components, or we're not going to do it, and certainly in food sovereignty. So as we think about challenges, right, we also have to be cognizant that many tribes have governments that don't have a lot of capacity, right? So we have to recognize tribal government stressors, right? And we have to build that capacity. In every one of our partnerships, again, at the United Nations, I was asked, we'd like to partner with you. We want to come in and map wetlands and range health and bring in these graduate students from Clark University. And I mentioned the only way that we're going to enter into a partnership with you is if you put Blackfeet Community College students under those Clark graduate students and you simultaneously credential them. Because if we're not thinking about how we expand that prom committee, right, expand those boots on the ground, right, those movers and shakers in Indian communities, then we're going to continue to be at the behest and reliant upon outside organizations. So we have to build that capacity internally. I always just do that just to make sure you're awake, right? So many of the things that we do, and I'll talk about it next, how we plan, right? The methodologies and how we plan, right, is really to utilize all members of our community. And so this is, and I'm not going to read it, but this is our mission, right? But I am going to speak a little bit more to that diagram that you see, or that graphic. So as we think about knowledge to action, action to knowledge, knowledge to action, right? That circle again, right? That circle, we want to be ensuring that we're creating everything that we need to from an indigenous perspective, in our case, from a Blackfeet perspective, right? So that's how we utilize native-led conservation, how we utilize native-led research, how we build capacity in our communities. All of that, right, is a part of that model. So all of it is informed by our values, right? The practice of who we are as Blackfeet people. We have our stakeholders, we have new information. So as you go around that wheel, right, we know that it never ends, right? It doesn't matter whether you look at it from a quantum physics perspective, right, or you look at it moving away from that linear perspective, which tends to drive Western methodologies and Western approaches. So we want to utilize the practice of who we are, our traditional methodologies, right, pull them forward and allow them to manifest in a modern context so that we can begin to really address many of those challenges that were created from the changing of that food system. Okay, well, thank you, Jody. So as we think about how we plan and the methodology and how we plan, first we ground our planning in Piikani values and stewardship of the land. We absolutely know that health and well-being is correlated to the land and land use, right? That's who we are, and it's a practice of who we are. Second, we make sure that we're making our plans in-house. If we're going to build that capacity, if and when, right? If and when is the policy, right? If you have the capacity, you better be doing it internally, right? Because each time we create data for tribes so that we can substantiate our need, we're always going to be at the behest of those systems that don't even talk to each other, let alone provide adequate information for us to utilize. Right, so we need to be thinking about how we use high-quality data, how we recognize both traditional and modern livelihoods, right? So that means when we have our stakeholders at the table, we do have medicinal plant gatherers and traditional food preparers alongside commercial beef producers and bison producers, right? Grain growers, produce producers, right? We ensure that we're recognizing everyone that is utilizing the landscape. We engage in necessary partnerships to plan, right? We don't have all of that capacity. So as we build it through our tribal colleges, through our education institutions, through our training programs, it's important that we have national partnerships as well. We partner very closely with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, with the Native Land Project out of Montana State University. And so we're having many of them do research that is prioritized by us, right? That we can then utilize to not only substantiate need, but also to supplement our plans. So when we think about indigenous methodologies, we want to utilize Western science to substantiate those methodologies and not the other way around. Usually we look at the science, then we try and create the methodology, right? We have methodologies that are tried and true for 15,000 years, right? We just need to utilize them in a modern context, right? And then utilize Western science to substantiate what we already know, that they're very effective methodologies. We make sure that our plans are implementable, right? You know, as you look at measurable goals, measurable objectives, we can talk about those all day long. But if you're not making correlations to to human capital, who's going to do that work, right? And a timeline, when is that work going to be done? Then the probability again goes way down. So as you look at many government and large organization created strategic plans, they end up, you know, gathering dust, becoming shelf art, right? We utilize them for an inventory. We utilize them to substantiate the next grant, right? You know, we want to ensure that we're raising the probability for implementation, right? You know, so you do that by ensuring that you're making those core correlations. And then we learn how to plan better. We have to have an evaluation component that allows us to switch horses in midstream. As you look at utilizing Western science to substantiate everything that we're doing, we need to ensure that we have the ability to have some maneuverability, right? You know, so that we can change horses in midstream, if you will, right? If many of those approaches aren't working, because much of this work in Indian country is new knowledge. Well, it's not new knowledge to us, but it certainly is from a funder's perspective, right? So we need to have that ability to change strategies. So as you look at a holistic approach, what we're trying to accomplish is in the center, right? Culture and traditional foods, health and well-being, agriculture, food, and land access, right? We're making correlations to our strategic pillars on the left. We're utilizing our plans to get there. But if we're not thinking about how we unravel the jurisdictional complexities around trust land management, then it becomes very, very difficult for us to be really productive on land. So everything that we do at Blackfeet is translational so that other tribes can duplicate it. But we need to absolutely unravel those jurisdictional complexities. So we're working on a couple of different programs around that. In terms of implementing our vision, we have several irons in the fire right now. We're looking at our E&E initiative, our bison reintroduction into the wild, and as a livestock designation. We're working on a Blackfoot Prime beef label, a co-op that will support the beef bison processing plant. We're in the middle of a feasibility study that really looks at beef and bison processing, allows us to move into that space. We're working on our local food delivery system, how we get that nutritious food back into our local food delivery system so that our people are benefiting as well. We're working on international market access, a international trade umbrella that allows us to enter into our own trade agreements as a sovereign, right? So that will allow us to market our beef in places like Great Britain where U.S. producers aren't allowed. So as you look at the legal framework, right, and the ability to create that umbrella, we're following Oneida's example, right? They created a free trade zone with their county government, and they're figuring out how they're utilizing that to market their products internationally as well. So we want to be cognizant about that as well. Indigenous-led conservation. We're in the middle of a feasibility study that will allow us to not only preserve our biodiversity and market our products at a higher rate, but it'll also allow us to collect fees on a state highway so that we have revenue generating streams that are more sustainable, so that we can underwrite necessary agriculture and natural resource management. And we're working on GIS inventory and mapping. I'm going to get a lot faster because I only have a minute and a half left. So this is our, you can find our food sovereignty strategic plan at www.blackfeetarmp.com. It'll show you our strategic pillars, right? You know, and so I'm not going to go over them. We can have an offline conversation, but those are really the larger overarching goals for our plan. And then this is just a graphic of our partnerships. So as you look at entering into necessary partnerships, we have several partnerships nationally and internationally that are doing a lot of the work for us, right? So as we think about Indigenous-led anything, we're utilizing those partnerships to really help us substantiate everything that we need to do. And so with that, thank you.